much do you know about like historiography around like the Holocaust and stuff?
A little bit.
Or
Yep.
basically there's these two schools of thought in like Holocaust history studies, intentionalism and functionalism. And intentionalism is like you thought the Nazis wanted to kill all the Jews from like the very start. And some people take that ridiculously far. Like there was this guy who wrote a book on it, Daniel Goldhagen. He wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, and he studied one particular police battalion in Poland. And I think that like his whole thesis basically just came down to the Germans were evil and they wanted to kill like Jews or something. And he argued with Christopher Browning about it, who wrote a much better, more nuanced book called Ordinary Men, where he looked at what turned these guys into murderers, because they were all like just ordinary dudes who went and joined a police battalion in Poland, and they took Jews out into the forest and shot them. And he asked like, what makes someone become that sort of person? And like he was a lot more nuanced. I think the answer that he came up with was something like it involved peer pressure, and which is kind of weird. Like a lot of people thought that that was a weird argument, but I think that that kind of makes a little bit more sense. So like, and functionalism is the other one where like you think that the Holocaust basically came out of the realities of the war, like or like it developed out of World War II. And of course, the real answer is that it's somewhere in the middle between these two things. I think everyone has generally settled on that by now. But if you take functionalism to its logical conclusion, then you get our friend Daryl Cooper. Because that guy, yeah, like that guy is like, oh my God, I don't think they didn't mean to, or they only did the Holocaust because of the war. And it's so like that was what was in his Twitter thread. I did not watch the Tucker Carlson interview, although I did see some of it. I don't know what the fuck. I don't know if this guy's a historian or not. There's nothing about his credentials like anywhere. But yeah, I don't. Yeah.
I only watched I watched just before stream to see if there's anything I need to prepare for. And the only thing he mentions is anything substantial is like, he says, why don't any historians like consider to look at what the Germans were feeling in the interwar period? Like, how did they see the world? I'm like, bro, like every cunt on earth talks about this fucking shit. Like they're like the entire Third Reich series is from the Third Reich perspective. Like it's talking about how they felt, what was going on in internal society. Like it tells you all that. Yeah, how they felt about Versailles and how they felt about the fear of communism and how they felt about the fucking betrayal or the stab in the back myth, and how actually anti-Semitism was not a driving force right at the beginning. It was actually more to do with public humiliation and wanting to long for a time of stability and the democracy without Democrat. Yeah, like there's so endless shit about this particular part of the story. And it's like it's every fucking person. It's every time that some fucking hack shithead has to come in and be like, hey, listen, kids, here's what they didn't tell you in high school, all right? Did you know that Tame Impala was only one guy? Like, yeah, it's always some really obvious shit. Like, you ever heard of Imperial Japan? Like, yeah, I've heard of Imperial Japan, you fucking dick. Like, but yeah, but they rely so fucking hard on their audience having not read and not knowing anything. And then they just get to say, media doesn't want to talk about this. No one wants to talk about this. It's like, shut up. Yeah.
We learned that shit in high school. We learned about the fucking Treaty of Versailles. That was like, I mean, I live in Canada, but like, I'm sure that you must have learned about that in fucking, like, I don't know, do you guys call it high school? The second one?
Secondary school, yeah.
Yeah, you guys must have, like, that's like such basic shit. Like, he starts out this Twitter thread talking about like the naval blockade that Britain did of Germany during World War II and all the people who died during it. And like, I think he said that was Churchill's fault because Churchill was, I think, in charge of the Navy at the time. I don't know if that's true or not. My World War I history is, but I don't know. And then like he spends a bunch more tweets in that thread to like being like, oh, woe is Germany. This is all the terrible shit that happened during the Treaty of Versailles. And it's like, yes, we know. Everybody knows this. The Treaty of Versailles was not good for Germany. I don't know. Like that's so, yeah. But
I guess he doesn't mention
yeah,
that
I
the
thought
Treaty
the
of Versailles
intentionalism
was...
functionalism would be. It's kind of funny. I think this guy strays off into obviously he strays off into insane levels of historical revisionism. Somebody in the chat or somebody in your stream chat mentioned that this guy apparently did a 25-hour podcast on Israel Palestine that was really like immersive, and like he did like a based both sides thing, which is not what one would expect from someone who seems to be sympathetic towards Hitler.
Well, the
Yeah, I don't know.
the Daryl guy, not Doctor.
Yeah,
Sorry.
the Daryl
Okay.
guy. Yeah.
Oh, they have a segment here. He talks about it for 10 minutes. Maybe we'll watch that in the end. Who knows? Or as a primer. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be kind of interesting. I mean, I guess everyone can surprise you, but
Listen, guys, this is what. Just bear in mind, this is what no one wants to talk about. Okay, this guy's going to talk about all the things no one wants to talk about. Okay, you're going to hear all kinds of new things. Let's go.
So I do think it's fair to ask, like, what really was going on. So for example, and I'm American, I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War.
Whoa.
Now, he didn't kill the most people.
Okay.
He didn't commit the most atrocities, but I believe, and I think when you really get into it,
he didn't start any of the wars. That's probably an important one, isn't it?
Tell the story right and don't leave anything out. You see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland, or just, I mean, at every step of the way, like people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a two-step process.
Well,
right?
why don't you just make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people
cool.
are thinking, well, wait a second. You just said Churchill, my childhood hero.
I'll give you my take first of all, just so we know what's what, because Churchill's not my childhood hero. He was a very problematic person. He was an arch imperialist from the Edwardian era, basically. He thought that colonized people deserved it and that it was good that the fucking imperialists made their countries the way that they were, and a more civilized race, I think he described them as, was willing to do the governing job properly for them. He was a massive fuck up militarily. I think his military exploits in the First World War actually got a whole bunch of British people killed, like British soldiers, and massively discredited him. Don't know that much about his domestic policy, apart from just like the odd like racism and shit like that. His journalism was very apologetic to the empire. The way he wrote about the concentration camps in South Africa was that he basically glossed over the suffering and just said that it was like, what was the line that he used to the Times? He said that they procured the minimum of suffering, and he said this when like a third of people were dying, so and mostly of like diseases and shit like that. So yeah, he had a very problematic past. At the end of the day, though, World War II. He is also seen as the guy, rightly so, who, when everyone else had given up and everyone else was done, including people in his own cabinet, had either joined the Nazis or had supported them or had got into a kind of like marriage of convenience like the Soviets or had surrendered, Britain, 1940, 1941, stood up alone and didn't give up. Even after a bunch of fucking British people were pushed all the way back to the coasts of Paris and to Dunkirk, and the fact that they had to get evacuated by this last minute scuffed pulling together of resources, to the point where you had just average civilians in their little boats, little fishermen coming across the channel to rescue British soldiers. And by the bravery and the sheer luck, I suppose, to some degree, of the RAF, and I suppose like the sophistication of the Spitfires, they were able to cover themselves on the sea and get people evacuated. And then in the battle for Britain, the air battle for Britain, they managed to prevail basically like against the odds. They were not in a good position and they still managed. And in part, the reason that Britain managed to hold off the Germans was because of the stubbornness, arguably the not very sophisticated stubbornness of Winston Churchill. Okay, so I will say, in terms of World War II, everyone was shit. Everyone was quite shit in World War II. Stalin was a shit. Hitler was a massive shit. Japan shit. The French mega shit. The fact that World War II could have ended so early, because the French had the better army. They had the better army. They had the biggest, baddest army in Europe. That was their reputation at the time. The Germans had this tactic though. They got a bit they steamrolled Poland, but it was harder than they thought it would be. They were actually kind of surprised by how many people they lost and how much equipment they lost in Poland. Hitler was apprehensive about a wider war in Europe. It wasn't like they weren't dominating in the way that they hoped they would. So when the Nazis were going for France, they had this little plan. They sent a decoy invasion up through Belgium and the Netherlands, which was kind of like the World War II tactic, like the World War I tactic. And it basically looked like a kind of boring slog, might have got back into like trenches potentially. So it was like kind of like a slog invasion that was probably going to be fairly underwhelming. There wasn't anything that creative in it. So they launched this little offensive in the north, but it's a dummy. So it pulls the British and the French elite forces up to the north. But then what they're doing as well, and this is reported by French reconnaissance, is that they can see in the Ardennes, which is to the south of where the first dummy attack is, they can see there's a massive military bottleneck. There's a huge military convoy approaching. And French military leaders are like, nah, what? Fake. You can't, because you can't get tanks through the forests in the Ardennes. The Ardennes is uncrossable. Fuck you. Like, bullshit. They ignored it. So you have this bottleneck, this massive offensive convoy, and it's just sitting there. It's a sitting duck. They could have sent a few goons over in planes, bombed the shit out of it, and that could basically be the war over. But they thought the Ardennes was like, you can't get that much like military movement across the Ardennes quickly enough. Like they're not going to try that. It's bullshit. But obviously their tanks and their equipment was more sophisticated. They were able to get large movements through the Ardennes, through the forest, and then they basically steamrolled the French. They like caught them by surprise. The French and the British had to get pushed all the way back. The French had to surrender, and then at the end, you've got fucking like the British just about escaping by the skin of their teeth in Dunkirk. A bunch of people died in Calais as well, just to let that happen, and a bunch of French people died as well to hold off the German advance. So all hope is gone, you'd think. But then Churchill didn't make any stupid fucking convenience pact with the Nazis only to get shafted later, okay, like the Soviets and like other British leaders did. Halifax wanted to surrender. Chamberlain probably was like not too keen on fighting either. But Churchill, that brave man, that brave soul. Roosevelt, the United States, fuck off. They didn't want anything to do with it. They were dominated by isolationists. It took Pearl Harbor and a bunch of fucking sailors getting mogged by the Japanese to get them involved, okay? So, fuck them. Churchill stands there and to this day uttered those brave words. We shall fight them on the beaches, we shall fight them on the hills, we shall fight them in the streets. We shall make the British Empire and the French Republic, and that it belongs with the Majesty's government. We will never surrender. And then, all on his own in his darkest hour, probably shit-faced. You know what? Like at the end of the day, the Nazis were they had to fight like effectively on two fronts. You know, Barbarossa on one side, and then fighting the Western powers on the other. Yeah. Eventually, thankfully, the Americans got involved. It took Pearl Harbor. Churchill really wanted the Americans to get involved, and he seized that opportunity with like Pearl Harbor as well. But at the end of the day, in terms of decisions in World War II, Churchill's one really to just keep fighting, even though there wasn't that much hope, was probably like the most courageous act of any other like leader in that war. Like Molotov-Ribbentrop was snaky, stupid, and the things that Stalin did to try and keep that pact upheld by just sending more fucking materials to the Germans, that was stupid. Okay. Hitler, obviously, big shithead, started the whole thing. The French, well, you know, they could have like very potentially ended the war quite quickly had their leaders been a bit more humble. Americans took Pearl Harbor. Churchill, you know, he was all for it even before Britain was attacked. So that's my position. You know, he's not. Is he a hero or a villain? But he's both. He's like there are no heroes or villains. There are just some people do better and some people do worse at different times. Pilots and engineers of the Spitfire contributed a lot, but I think you're right. Yeah, obviously. Okay, but the leadership matters as well. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Yes, the Spitfires were important. As were, I mean, what other innovations did we have, like in World War, the dummy army, the fake army? Which general was it? Patton. Who was the general with the ghost army? The way that they were able to split up German defenses before launching the invasion at Normandy. Yeah, this guy, fucking fake tanks and shit. They made fake tanks. and soldiers and little fake fucking paramilitaries coming down from the air to split the German forces. Look at this. It's a fucking bouncy castle. And good memes. World War II there's lots of good memes. There were also at the same time, actually, the Germans who infiltrated the Allies, like English-speaking Germans who infiltrated the Allies and started giving like fake and confusing intelligence to everyone and throwing them all off. Like, anyway, good memes. Okay, but I might be wrong. Okay, here's what they don't want to talk about though. This guy who doesn't seem to be a historian or whatever else, but okay.
Bro, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, oh, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
That they're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead.
So this is what you mean by the functionalism to its most brain-dead extreme. First of all, okay, it's always like taking things that are true if you nuance them, but just not the way that he's saying it. It seems to be that the idea of a final solution to the Jewish question was articulated very, around basically the same time of Barbarossa. And we know that in written documentation, it went from Himmler to the SS by 4 weeks after the invasion of the Soviet Union to impose a final solution to the Jewish question. Now, it wasn't clear to everyone at the time that meant exterminate them. Some people thought it meant expel them. But in any case, a ton of them died, okay? So between the summer of 41 and the end of 41, you got 500,000 Jews are already getting shot, gunned down by the Einsatzgruppen. By late 41, they're already using carbon monoxide poisoning in these mobile gas facilities. That was kind of a bit of a materializing plan, okay? They're already constructing Chelmno and Treblinka, was it? Those two death camps? They're already getting under construction in 41. I think, is one of them not finished either by the end of 41 or the very beginning of 42? So, and then Wannsee Conference, it's completely explicit, yeah. So they kind of had a plan a bit early on for that. That was already taking hold. I think Hitler had already authorized moving for the train journeys for German Jews to get, and people under the general government, it was called, to move them towards Poland, like Eastern Poland, where most of them would die. So that's kind of, to say that they had no plan, it's not really no plan. It's more like a work in progress at that time. Like a plan is already taking shape and people are dying, right? Like they're being murdered under orders. So as for the rest of them, for the Slavs, that was what, I'm pretty sure the general plan for the East, General Plan Ost, I think the first version of that plan was July 15th? Yeah. The first version of the plan was handed to Himmler, and this is the TLDR, the general plan for the East was that the Nazis could not feed. They needed to use all the resources that in Eastern Europe to feed themselves, to feed their soldiers. And they wanted living space, because that's the whole idea, was the Lebensraum for the fucking German people to do their stupid, idyllic fucking farm life, whatever, which takes a lot of land, right? So they come up with this idea to either starve them out or to expel them, to the point that they had percentages, right? So if I just read this passage from Richard Evans, which again, this is called The Third Reich in Power, it's from the German perspective. So the first version of the plan was handed to Himmler on July 15th, 41 by Professor Konrad Meyer, an academic expert in the office who specialized in settlement policy. When I say German perspective, I mean it's talking about World War II and the Third Reich, but as in how it was in the Third Reich. Anyway, not the Nazi perspective, okay? The guy's a social democrat, I'm pretty sure. Okay. After a good deal of discussion and further refinement, it was finalized in May 1942, approved by Hitler, and formally adopted by the Reich Security Head Office in July 1942. The general plan for the East, now the official policy of the Third Reich, proposed to remove between 80 and 85% of the Polish population, 64 of the Ukrainian, and 75 of the Belarusian, expelling them further east or allowing them to perish from disease or malnutrition. So he says they had no plan. The plans were already circulating amongst the top brass in July 41. It's funny though, he says but obviously it wasn't put into action. It wasn't official until 42. But it's funny how he's saying there was no plan, but it's they had a rough idea of what they were going to do. And as was already happening naturally, because obviously the Blitzkrieg would result in people fleeing anyway. And they didn't always keep prisoners of war. And the Warsaw Ghetto was already becoming a thing. So that's a very strange way to summarize that they had no plan. Okay.
One, from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is 2 months into the invasion, right? And my view on this.
When he says one person said that, I feel like you should probably emphasize what the other people were thinking, no? The spin is fucking mental. Just it's a circumstance of the war. Bro, most people at that time were much more leaning towards the idea of either expelling them or letting them starve. But, okay. Huh. I like how they say one person, okay? He give you a clue, but if you're not sharp, if you're Tucker Carlson, that's just gonna bounce off of your little fucking smooth brain, slide off it.
I argue with my Zionist interlocutors about this all the time with regard to the current war in Gaza. Look, man, maybe you, as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond and you'd be crippled and all of Europe would be under threat and whatever it was that maybe you thought you had to do that. But at the end of the day, you launched that war.
Is it because the Hitler from the 20s onwards had very clearly articulated his desire to establish a living space in Eastern Europe? No? Is that not a variable? Lebensraum? Is he going to mention that? Oh, okay.
With no plan to care for the millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war that were going to come under your control. And millions of people died because of that, right? And you can look at it and say
yeah, it's not really fear of the Soviets. Well, the Nazis saw Stalin get fucking mogged by the Finns and realized that Soviet defenses were going to be a lot weaker than they anticipated. So in terms of Molotov-Ribbentrop, the non-aggression pact / kind of alliance between Nazis and Soviets, both sides knew it wasn't going to last. It was supposed to last for 10 years. Both sides knew it wouldn't last that long. No one expected it to only last 2 years, but one of the reasons it was cut short by the Nazis was because they saw that the Soviets were a potentially easy target, that getting them now would be easier than letting them build up their military and learn from their mistakes at Finland and get them when it's more difficult. That's why they thought that going in quickly would catch them by surprise, which it did, would allow them to steamroll all the way up to Moscow and Stalingrad, which it kind of did. They wanted to do that quickly. The idea was to go quickly. But it was because they wanted the land. They had an ideological commitment and an entitlement to the land. And they saw an opportunity to do that because the Soviets were... Is he not going to mention any of that that's a motivating factor? Or no? Okay.
So get back to your main question about Churchill. If you go to 1939, when the Germans and the Soviet Union invade Poland, as soon as that war's wrapped up on the German side, Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain and France because they had already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually. There's a famous scene where he kind of throws a fit when he finds out that they did do that. And so he doesn't want to fight France. He doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there. And he starts firing off peace proposals. He says,
Why does he keep saying we've got the threat to the east? It's so fun. Again, bear in mind, in terms of charitability, remember that this guy is speaking to an audience who he knows nothing. Okay, and Tucker Carlson knows nothing because Tucker Carlson's retarded, and he will guzzle absolutely anything that sounds good to his audience. So he loves this. Okay, so the guy he's already told you that the Nazis invaded Soviet Union with no idea what to do for the civilians, and apparently one person thought it would be more humane to kill them all than let them starve, and that their motivations for attacking the Soviets were what? I don't know. Were they afraid of communism, the threat of communism? Were they afraid that the Soviets would invade them? Like, do you realize how much he's leaving out there? Like the amount of important details, the fact that the Nazis had already very clearly demonstrated their appetite for living space with what they did in Czechoslovakia, with what they did in Austria. The fact that they were given an inch in Czechoslovakia and they took a mile, or in other words, the entire country. Okay. I know he can't really say that though, because the point in him saying that or omitting that is that he needs to make it look like World War II and the escalation, that the Nazis were not active agents, that he needs to minimize their agency as much as possible. It's actually not too different from the Russia-NATO argument, because the idea that Churchill refusing peace with the Germans after they've taken over France and Poland and Czechoslovakia. Yeah, the whole idea is that he wants people to think that it was Churchill who motivated the decisions of the Nazis, and like there was nothing within the Nazis' internal logic and internal reasoning to inspire them to A, murder all the Jews, and 2, to try and conquer Eastern Europe or even the entire world, right? So, okay.
Not do this. Like, we can't do this. And of course, a year goes by, 1940 comes around, and they're still at war. And so he launches his invasion to the West, takes over France, takes over Western and Northern Europe. Once that's done, and the British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent.
Apart from
in other words, the war is over.
Our brave man.
And the Germans won.
Our brave hog.
But by what point?
Fall of 1940, right? So there's literally no opposing force on the continent. And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this is what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people... I mean,
that's just true, though. Like, so, never mind. Let's just keep going. Okay.
Would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. We don't, which is not what ended up happening, but that's what everybody thought was going to happen. And so Churchill, you have a guy Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany. And the reason that I don't begrudge him that, people can national leaders, you can fight whoever you want. If you feel like your the long-term interests of the British Empire are threatened by the rise of a powerful continental power like Germany, and you need to check that those are great power games, and you play them the way you feel like you need to play them. That's fine. The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest. Just rank terrorism, going through and
Is he going to mention what Germany did before? Churchill did want to bomb German cities, but he only did it after the Luftwaffe bombed London for 55 plus days. Like, that's what gave Churchill his green light to bomb German cities. But okay.
According to what eventually,
we can get into the morality of all that if you want to later. That's a more difficult question.
It became just a carpet bombing, saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods. To kill is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible. And all the men were out in the field. All the fighting age men were out in the field. And so this is old.
It wasn't to kill as many civilians as possible. Hang on, that wasn't the goal. Was to, first of all, to divert, which it actually did successfully, was to divert their It wasn't necessarily people think it was to destroy military infrastructure. That's not true. Okay. They tried targeting military infrastructure, which was often on the outskirts of cities that they couldn't really target because if they were going there in the daytime, it was really dangerous. Bombers were slow. They were not particularly powerful. Anti-air defense it was strong enough. Like the Luftwaffe would just fuck them up. They would lose way too many people trying to do it. And they did try to do it, and they lost too many people doing it. So instead, what they would do is they would go at night. And they were safer at night, but the trade-off is that you can't target shit at night. So the only thing you can target is the most densely lit up places like cities. So they would go to cities and bomb areas that didn't necessarily have that much military infrastructure. But what it did do was it did demoralize the population, and it also diverted massive resources because now the Germans had to move a ton of their resources that could have been used in the Eastern Front and even later the Western Front into air defense. That was those were two of the benefits militarily of those bombings. But they were targeting civilians, but it wasn't to kill as many as possible. I wonder if I can find the line on, because I just want to show you what actual historians say about this rather than just some random dweeb on the internet. So let's see. Let's go from one paragraph before. All right. This is all about German air defense soaking up a lot of their needed resources. Kraut did a good video this long ago. I don't actually agree necessarily with the Kraut video, but hang on. All right. Moreover, the need to combat the bombing absorbed more and more German resources, with a third of all artillery production going on anti-aircraft guns by 1944, and 2 million people engaged on anti-aircraft defense or repairing and clearing up after raids. German air superiority was lost on the Eastern Front, where fighters and bombers were no longer present in numbers sufficient to offer the ground forces the support they needed to defeat the Red Army. Support that had played such a key role in the early stages of the war. Allied bombers were able to pulverize the roads, bridges, and railways behind the Normandy beaches in 1944, making it impossible for the German army to bring up adequate reinforcements. Had the German Air Force retained the command of the skies, the invasion could not have taken place. It has been argued, therefore, that bombing helped save lives by shortening the war, and in particular that it saved Allied lives by weakening German resistance. Nevertheless, it also caused between 400,000 and half a million deaths in Germany's towns and cities, the overwhelming majority of them civilian. Of these people, some 11,000 were killed up to the end of 1942, perhaps 100,000 in 1943, 200,000 in 44, and between 50,000 and 100,000 in the last months of the war in 45. Around 10% were foreign workers and prisoners of war. All these figures are extremely approximate, but about their concentration in the last 2 years of the war, there can be no doubt. On the Allied side, some 80,000 airmen were killed in the bombing raids, along with 60,000 British civilians in German raids. And quite possibly as many again in German aerial attacks on Warsaw, Rotterdam, Belgrade, Leningrad, Stalingrad, and other European cities. About 40% of housing stock in German towns and cities with more than 20,000 inhabitants was destroyed. In some cities like Hamburg and Cologne, the figure was as much as 70%. And in some smaller towns like Paderborn or Gießen, virtually every single dwelling was rendered uninhabitable. Devastation was enormous and took many years to make good. The German dead were not mere collateral damage, to adopt the phrase made familiar by wars in later years and other places. Undermining civilian morale, even wreaking revenge on Germany and the Germans, unquestionably belonged among the aims of the strategic bombing offensive, although attacks on civilians have customarily been regarded as a war crime. Even if one does not accept that the entire bombing campaign was unnecessary, then it is at least arguable that it was continued longer than was strictly necessary, and conducted especially in the final year of the war in a manner that was too indiscriminate to be justifiable. Arguments will no doubt continue to rage on this difficult question. So, what is undeniable is that the bombing had a huge effect on civilian morale. The hope of some in Britain that it would inspire ordinary Germans to rise up against the Nazis and to bring the war to an early end by an active revolution was unrealistic. Obviously, they were more concerned with survival. But yeah, after the war, people were asked what the hardest thing was to put up with. 91% said the bombings. More than a third said that it had lowered people's morale, including their own. It did even more than the defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa to spread popular disillusion about Nazi Germany. That was the goal of the bombings. I think Stalin asked them to do it in Dresden to soften the ground for an invasion because they didn't want to go through another Budapest, but it was also because they wanted to divert resources and to demoralize the population. The goal was not just to kill as many civilians as possible. Like that's That's a very crude way of putting it, but okay.
People, it's women and children, and they knew that, and they were wiping these places out. It was as gigantic scaled terrorist attacks, the greatest, scale of terrorist attacks you've ever seen in world history.
Why would he do that?
Because it was
Why
the
would
only
he
means
do
that they
that?
had to continue fighting at the time.
Tucker
They didn't
Carlson.
have the ability to reinvade Europe, and so he needed to keep this war going until he accomplished what he hoped to accomplish. We know now there's actually a really great series of books. It's one of the best. I recommend it to everybody, but it's really expensive now, and it's 6 long volumes called History of British Special Operations in the Second World War. And one of the books gets into the level of just the extent of media operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into that war.
Just so we know, if you're going to talk about the reason Churchill wanted to continue fighting and continue to fight with whatever means that they had, it's because there are 2 opinions. One is more cynical, and I think it's maybe less true, or true to a lesser extent, is Churchill was an arch imperialist. He wanted to protect the empire, and he thought the British Empire was threatened, obviously, by an emerging Nazi empire in Europe and North Africa, because the Nazis did fight in North Africa as well. That's obviously the one more crude, like he just wanted to protect his assets or whatever. But the other reason, and I think the reason that he was a lot more vocal about, was that Churchill, in a very simplistic way, but quite true, believed that with Hitler, if you give him an inch, he'll take everything. There's no point. If you give him 1 foot in the door, he will fucking barge in and take your entire house, and probably the one next to it, and the one next to it. Like, there was no end to the Nazi hunger for territory, and there was no end to the Nazi dehumanization of people who stood in their way, like the Slavs or the Jews or whoever else. So we know this. We know that he correctly predicted it at the Munich Agreement. He knew that the Munich Agreement, which was basically permitting the Germans to annex the Sudetenland, he knew that they wouldn't be happy with that. He knew that they would take more, which they did. There's a whole thing. It's called the Rape of Czechoslovakia, where they give them the German majority areas of Czechoslovakia, and the Nazis go in and they're like, okay, nice one. Let's just keep going. And then they take all of it because they want the resources and they want the land and they want the living space. And they didn't stop. They took more than they were given. So just after the Munich Agreement, this was what Churchill said, because Churchill massively opposed the Munich Agreement, and this was his condemnation. You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You choose dishonor and you will have war. And do not suppose that this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup which we will be proffered to us year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor we arise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time. He knew, because if you looked at what Hitler was saying, if you looked at his behavior, if you looked at what the Nazi ideology was, and people were very aware of this, you knew that you couldn't just give them German majority areas and keep them happy. They didn't want that. They said they didn't want that. They said they wanted everything, right? And they tried to take everything. So, okay.
And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either
Can you read it again in your Churchill voice? $100.
Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us.
What do you think I am?
And that was the plan, and kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war. And
what was the motive?
Oh, yeah. So I just gave the answer to that. He should know. He should know what was in Churchill's mind because he said it explicitly a million times. He's going to say it's because he wanted to defend the empire. He didn't want another empire coming up. That's it. He's going to start and end with that.
Well, Churchill's got a long, complicated
Or he just
history.
liked war, I guess.
I mean, he's somebody who
That was the wryest smile I think I've ever seen.
He knows.
Well, look, I think on one level there was a sense that Churchill was sort of humiliated by his performance in the First World War as the head of the Admiralty, and he was out in the cold for a long time.
I mean, Gallipoli.
Yeah, and which was his operation.
Yeah,
and so he was rightly held responsible for that and seen as responsible for one of the
He
great
had Hitler derangement syndrome. True. Adolf derangement syndrome. It's very real. I don't know if it's curable.
disasters that the British suffered during that war. And so I think part of it was probably kind of personal.
Oh, maybe, he might want to say the Jews controlled him, but I don't know. I don't know.
He wanted redemption. He wanted to go out there and prove that he's the warlord that they can go out there and fight this big war. Probably. I think part of it, I read about Churchill, and
by the way, it's worth noting that like the British declaration of war didn't actually come from Churchill. It was Churchill was he replaced Chamberlain after the war started. It was Chamberlain who declared war because of what happened with Poland. So he's going to say that Chamberlain was like the warmonger when he made that peace pact with Poland, that defense pact or whatever, mutual defense pact.
Strikes me as a psychopath.
But
he's also a sort of, I mean, he was a drunk. Okay. He was very childish in strange ways. People would talk about how, as an adult, like as prime minister, they'd find him in his room and he's like playing with action figures like war toys and army men and stuff, and would get mad when people would interrupt him, when he was doing that. So this is a strange fellow, There's all those things. But then you get into, why was Winston Churchill such a dedicated booster of Zionism from early on in his life, right?
Oh, it's the Jews. Okay. It's the Jews. It's the Jews. Okay, it's the Jews. Wait, why did I think about that? Why didn't I think about the Jews? I forgot to consider the Jews. It's the Jews. This is after the British betrayed Zionism, right? This is after 1939. I know Churchill didn't agree with it, but this is after the British wanted Churchill in. Like the leadership wanted Chamberlain gone after the war with Poland, after war was declared. He had completely discredited himself, by the way. But they were done with Zionism by that point. This was like after the white paper. This was after they offered it all to the Palestinians. and that's after they offered it to the Palestinians with a few caveats. Like, what was the caveat? Pending relations. We'll see what happens in 10 years with regards to sovereignty. And also, we will fuck off like we'll cap immigration at 75,000 over 5 years. And then after that, it's done. It's a very big stretch to say the British betrayed Zionism. I mean, they literally offered a proposal that involved no Jewish state. But okay.
There's ideological reasons. Like in 1920, he wrote a kind of infamous now article called Zionism versus Bolshevism. And he basically makes the case that, which was true to a large extent, that all of Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, which is where the vast majority of Jews lived, other than the United States, which is where a lot of them had traveled to, that area had become so engulfed by a revolutionary spirit that all the young Ashkenazi Jews who were over there were getting swept up into it. It was the 60s here on steroids, right? And in a much more serious and ended up being destructive way. And this is 1920, so this is shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. Basically, the point of his paper is he says these people who are over there, they're all going one direction or the other.
It's also funny that, oh God, this guy is like, here are my red flags, okay? Because I'm starting this from a blank slate, okay? I know all the sirens in my brain are wanting to call this guy a Nazi or whatever, but let's not, okay? Let's just point out some of the red flags. So Churchill's reasoning is in part because he's dumb, childish, and drunk, okay? But you notice when they talk about the Nazis and Barbarossa, and that decision being, fear of communism, or we're worried that there might be a Soviet offensive on us and we want to get the upper hand quickly and all that. It's all very rationalized, isn't it? It's all very like, there could have been some understandable reasons for why they wanted to invade the Soviet Union. But he won't mention on the other end that the Nazis were literally drugged to the fucking gills. And like, we'll get to Hitler in a second, but like the soldiers were all taking this shit, like Pervitin, which is basically a methamphetamine, or it's crystal meth. Like that's what it is. It was over the counter back then. But also that Hitler himself had this fucking quack doctor who gave him like a cocktail of what is, in simplified terms, is like derivative. It would be like next door to a cocktail of cocaine and heroin. And then they also raided pharmacies and apothecaries from other countries as well. I was at the Apothecary Museum in Latvia, and there's a whole section about how the Nazis had a field day when they found it, like all the commanders and political leaders. Oh yeah, him tweaking at the Berlin Olympics. But apparently that doesn't, we're not going to talk about drugs and how that affected Hitler's reasoning, and not to mention megalomania and surrounding himself with yes men and all that kind of shit. It's only Churchill who basically was a functioning like a whiskey drinker, right? He would drink whiskey like throughout the day. I don't think he was ever like bleezing, or rarely. He was just kind of like tipsy most of the time. I think it's unfair to say that he wasn't nearly as drugged up as the Nazis were. But Hitler, Berlin Olympics.
Be Bolsheviks, they're going to be Zionists. We want them to be Zionists, and yes. So we need to support this. And so that was early on. There was an ideological component of it. But then as time goes,
here he is tweaking. at the Olympics. He's just excited. He wasn't a well man. He was not well at all, especially during the war. He was like, he did also have like Parkinson's to the end of his life, I think.
Goes on, you read stories about Churchill going bankrupt and needing money, getting bailed out by people who...
Churchill sounded drunker than he was. I mean, I know he had a speech impediment. You're making fun of a Parkinson sufferer. I'm making fun of a Parkinson sufferer who is being fed a cocktail of fucking uppers and downers, okay?
Shared his interests, in terms of Zionism, but also his hostility, I think his hostility to, put it this way, I think his hostility to Germany was real.
Okay.
I don't think that he necessarily had to be bribed to have that feeling. But, I think he was, to an extent, put in place by people, the financiers, by a media complex that wanted to make sure that he was the guy who was representing Britain in that conflict for a reason. And,
okay.
Churchill's
it's the Jews.
Again, it's so hard because and especially in a short interview like this where you have this guy.
Okay, this guy's a fucking quack. So the bias is already fucking unreal. Like everything is so tempered with the Nazis in Eastern Europe. It's so tempered when it comes to motivations for Barbarossa. But for Churchill, it's suddenly drunk, controlled by other people, hates the German. Like, fuck off, bro. Like, you're so transparent. Fucking hell. Tucker's loving it, though. Tucker's slurping. All right, 1 minute.
He's an Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Martin Luther King like type figure in the sort of Western consciousness, right?
Yes.
And so people have so many assumptions and built-in triggers, like when it comes to this guy, that it's hard to talk about him because you're always thinking about the triggers that you're setting off and your listeners. And I don't say that in a way of like, oh, I don't want to offend anybody.
No,
or whatever.
I understand.
It's that that things are going to be misunderstood. And so this is why I do 30-hour podcasts. By the way.
It's interesting because as a follower of your work, I don't see you as hostile to the West. I see you actually as a product of the West and as a defender really of the West or its values. In your approach, in your open-mindedness, rigor, belief in accuracy and honesty. I mean, those are Western notions.
Accuracy and honesty are Western notions. Just throw that one in. Yeah, those are Western notions. Also, I have not done any preparation for this interview. I have no fucking idea how to push back on anything. I don't know any of the context. I'm just letting this fucking podcaster tell me if it's fit about Churchill in World War II. And I'm just going to, when he says some certain people were influencing Churchill to keep up the war in Europe, and also, oh, by the way, Zionism. Why would he do that? Fucking hell, you stupid cunt. All right.
And yet Churchill has been positioned and is accepted as like the defender of the West over the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's, and I wonder why that is. I don't,
Yeah.
I mean, people can certainly take issue with any factual claims you're making.
Churchill impression.
I said $100. By the way, these, I just want the Nazis who watch this video to think I'm being funded by Jews, okay? Or I am a Jew. I don't know. Yeah.
I assume they're all right. They're consistent with what I think I know to be true. But why do you think Churchill has been presented in the way that he has?
Yeah, well, it has to do with what you said earlier, right? Neville Chamberlain versus Churchill has been the binary model that has served as the chief rhetorical device for...
Why are you saying dollars? Because 70% of my viewers are American. And I am a thoughtful person. If I say pounds, you guys don't know. Americans don't know anything about other countries. That's why you let retards like this tell you what's what about World War II. You'd never get away with this in the United Kingdom, okay? You'd never get away with it. We will never have a neo-Nazi uprising in the United Kingdom because every time they get any fucking attention in the media, all they do is they have one moron in their little fucking party who blogged about Churchill 5 years ago. Everyone finds out about it and everyone hates them. We might be racist. We might be stupid. We might have bad teeth. We might not know how to say every letter in the alphabet properly. But my God, we will not be Nazis. No, never happen.
Every conflict we've wanted to get into since then.
Yes.
The entire Cold War and then even after the Cold War in the global war on terror is if you appease them, you're Neville Chamberlain. Churchill's the one who saw all along where this was headed and was trying to warn people, this, Cassandra. And finally, because nobody listened to him, the war ended up breaking out, and we were forced to like go stamp out this threat. And now it's a much bigger threat than it ever would have been if we just would have listened to him.
If we had strangled it in its crib.
And it's justified every conflict, really since the Second World War. Everybody's the new Hitler, right? And so that it's very valuable in that sense. But then also, it really did become the founding myth of the global order that we're all living in now, right? Like, because when you think about, like, if you go back to think about like in Machiavelli's The Prince, right? And he starts that book out kind of talking about why he's writing this book. And one of the things that he says in there is, Italy is a bunch of broken up little principalities and city-states and stuff. And he's looking over to the west and the north and seeing countries like Spain, countries like France and England, who like these are countries that are now starting to operate on a totally different scale, like on a national, something approaching
nation states,
scale. And we have got to get our act together and start learning how to act on that level as well. And so that's why I'm writing this book. It's an instruction manual and like a call to action kind of. Well, as that goes on and the nation state starts to put itself together in the modern era, you get to World War I, and you think about what the nation state is, right? Like history, and to a large extent, global event style history is governed to a great degree by the military technology that's prevalent at a given time, right? So, like, I don't think it's an accident, for example, that the ancient Greeks had like a feeling of like citizen equality that was unprecedented in the world at the time, and they had their chief combat system was the phalanx.
Wasn't Churchill voted best or most important Brit in a poll a few years ago? Yeah, he's always the nation's favorite Brit. Yeah, always. People do get really brain dead about Churchill. Like people, the reverence, especially from people who don't really know that much about him, is kind of silly. But I mean, yeah, he's not losing that position anytime soon. This guy's not shaking it. This moron. All right.
Unit.
Right.
That required every man to stand by his fellow citizen as a unit, and that's what their position in the world depended on people being able to do that. I don't think that's a mistake, right? I don't think it's a mistake when you look at other societies where charioteers, really expensive bronze chariots, or when you get to like the High Middle Ages, where the heavy horse cavalry is just totally dominant on the battlefield, but so only the people who can afford that kind of a weapon system, they're the ones who are going to rule, and the people who don't like it, they really don't have any means to sort of express their own political will. And so as a nation state,
sorry, I was muted. I meant to say, so not only is this guy intentionally misleading, like dishonest, kind of a propagandist, probably evil, he's also boring. He's committed the final horseman. He's introduced the final horseman of the apocalypse. Oh God, the final horseman of the historical revisionist dumb apocalypse. So we're gonna have to speed him up now.
It starts to get put together. You start to have military conflicts and just military buildups on a scale that nobody's ever heard of before. I mean, you get to the First World War. I mean, millions and millions of men. And if you want to operate on that level, if you want to operate on the level of great game global politics, you got to be able to put an army of several million men in the field, and it's why countries who tried their hand at imperialism, like the Dutch and the Belgians, eventually they were just like, we're not.
Govno, I guarantee your opinions are more informed by propaganda than mine are. If you want to disagree with that, come in Discord. Let's go.
Doing it. And it's because they saw that. And so, when you look at the First World War and the Second World War, but really the First World War is like the apotheosis of the nation state in a lot of ways, where you have, if you think back to like an old king in the early modern period, or even, no, forget about that. Look at like Louis XIV.
Subscribe.
So the Sun King, right? Powerful as any monarch in Europe, like for hundreds of years. His actual ability to reach into the local affairs of some village and tell people how to act or what to think.
Pretty limited.
Very limited. Like we think, because of movies and TV, that a monarch is sitting on his throne and he just orders this and it happens, like God's saying, let there be light or something.
Behead him, yes.
Yeah. And that's just, they didn't have that kind of reach. They had influence, but they had like any modern individual politician, they had to work through existing structures and systems to get their will actually carried out. And that meant making compromises, and they just didn't have the resources to technological resources, but also just human and financial resources to get down to the granular level of control that would become common with the rise of the nation state. And so you get up to the point where, when the nations face off in World War I, and you have countries that, I mean, when you look at the level of efficient mobilization toward a single cause fighting the war, how the economy, how the government, everybody was on the same page. And, they were fighting this war as whole societies. Like they figured out a way that they could do what Louis XIV could never dream of. They could mobilize their whole society for war. And that was what you had to do if you wanted to compete on the level of Germany and France and so forth. And so what somebody like Churchill during the First World War, and probably actually the Second World War as well, most people, I think, players in the Second World War, what they thought they were doing was that this was a war between nation states, like World War I and so on and so forth. And it was not that. And we found out afterwards that it was not that there were two great military land empires, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural military land empires, the Soviet Union and the United States, and when I say empire, obviously, like we don't think of the U.S. pre-World War II in that way very much, but, we didn't start out with a whole continent under our control, right? We started out as 13 colonies and we grew through a confrontation with and a centuries-long race war against the natives, right? I mean, that was a formative experience.
Is he not going to elaborate at all on why he thinks Zionists and Jews were the reason that Churchill wanted to keep fighting with Hitler? I know he basically dropped that hint in the least subtle way possible, but does he never come back to that? Or is that just, there were certain people, they're such cowards, man. They're so cowardly. Why would you do that? Why would you just drop the most obvious constellation for us to join the dots for and just not elaborate at all on what you mean by that? Tucker asked a good question. Why did Churchill want to keep fighting an unwinnable war? Why?
Of America in its early history. And so it's an empire in a way, not the way we normally think. It's not like the British Empire, but I think you can call it that. And these two countries, that thing that Machiavelli was noticing when he was looking over at Spain and France, you actually had like Germany, for example. There's this idea that the only reason that they did Molotov-Ribbentrop was because Hitler needed to buy time so he could eventually invade the Soviet Union later or something like that. Not exactly true. I mean, that obviously he was talking about the eventual conflict with the Soviet Union very early in his career. That was there. But by the time you get up to like 1939, his views are starting to become more complicated on it, where he's starting to see the United States as the real chief threat to not just to Germany, but to Europe, because he saw himself as the sort of European defender, Messiah guy, right? So, and he looks over at Joseph Stalin and says, a lot of his people kind of thought this way, that this is not an international communist movement anymore. Like Trotsky's been banished from the country and his followers are all dead. They were killed during the purges of the late 30s. These people are all gone. Those are all of the people who, from the very beginning after the First World War, they saw Russia as the fountainhead of world revolution. And Stalin, he never quite gave that up, just like the United States, he saw it as his duty to build up.
This is completely untrue. Does he think Hitler had a nuanced understanding of communism? Do you think he's sitting there being like, oh, well, technically the means of production are no longer resembling anything along the lines of common ownership. Now it's more of a kind of bureaucratic state capitalism that you might describe the Soviet Union as. Therefore, the fuck are you talking about? Oh, because Trotsky's Jewish. No, Hitler thought the USSR was communist and full of Jewish influence. Like Bolshevism for him was a synonym for Jewishness. Which is why, no matter how many resources Stalin kept on giving to the Nazis, no matter how much he kept on increasing his supply of resources to the Nazis, they still invaded.
Ideologically aligned allies and so forth. But if you really look at what happened, and a lot of the Germans saw it this way, Stalin, what he did was kind of turn the Soviet Union into like a national socialist nation state, really. He kind of brought back the Russian Empire, and now it's called communist and stuff, but there's no goal to just set off global revolution. And then once that happens, the chips will fall where they may.
They kept inside the Kremlin, they kept all the paintings of St. George, the patron saint of Russia, all the crosses, the whole Stalin period, they're there.
Yeah. And I have nothing good to say about Stalin.
I don't either, but I don't think it's been misadvertised a little bit.
Yeah. And when I said that there's one episode that I have done where I feel like I didn't do my duty.
Okay. If you were religious, like Stalin was not, never mind.
To force myself to understand the perspective of the perpetrators. It was the one that I did about the Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe after the Second World War and what they did in Germany and other places, and specifically Romania, which is, as far as I can tell, like so far after 30 years of reading history books, is pretty much the worst thing that ever happened. These prison experiments that they ran in Pitești and other places in Romania after the Second World War are that's not family listening. If you really want to,
the Soviets did.
Yeah, the Soviet advisors were there. It was carried out technically by the Securitate and the Romanians themselves, but this was a program being run from Moscow, right? And it's whatever you're thinking it is out there, whoever's listening or watching this, it's 1,000 times worse. And I wouldn't recommend going and listening to my episode, The Anti-Humans, unless you're prepared for that. So I'll just leave it at that.
I just don't understand, like that thing he said about Hitler's more complex views on Stalin and the Soviet Union. Does this moron not know how much the Soviets tried to do to stay this invasion, or even just to delay it? It didn't work. Okay. Again, we can listen to an actual historian, okay? Just don't take my word for it, okay? I'm stupid. Okay, conquest of Russia, been the heart of Hitler's thinking since 1920s. My struggle, he mentions living space, Mentions it to the military staff in 1933 when he's in power, meeting chiefs of the armed forces. He said it was time to begin planning the event on July 1940, a year before Barbarossa. The prospect of a war in two fronts did not alarm Hitler. France had been eliminated, Britain seemed close to collapse. As for the Red Army, it had been decimated by Stalin's purges, and it had proved hopelessly incompetent in the war in Finland. Slavs, in any case, were subhumans, incapable of putting up serious resistance to a superior race. It's interesting, this would ultimately be their downfall, because during Stalingrad, when the Nazis held like 90% of the city, and the Soviets were reduced to basically throwing in people who they knew were probably going to die, but just having them there to delay the full capture of the city as long as possible, to the point that it wasn't just like a meat grinder strategy. That's a little bit unfair. What the Soviet soldiers also had to do was they had to get as close as possible to the enemy. The quote was that you had to hug the enemy, like in World of Warcraft, because you had to get close enough so that they couldn't use mortar fire. They couldn't use artillery because it would hit their own troops. Which is like a really scary, that's what they had to do. And they just had to sort of drip feed these people in to hug the enemy and keep them delayed for as long as possible. Because through that whole time, they were preparing a counteroffensive, a massive counteroffensive. And it was mostly secret, but some Nazis did see, some soldiers and some recon people, they did see irregular movements of Soviet forces behind the line in Stalingrad. But they just thought, there's no way the Slavs, those dumb fucks, can ever concoct such a plan, so they just didn't take it seriously. Anyway, Bolshevism only made them weaker. Hitler regarded it as a tool of the world Jewish conspiracy, which had succeeded in enslaving the Slavs and bending them to his will. There were, of course, many reasons why this view was little more than a fantasy, not the least of them being the fact that Stalin was himself anti-Semitic and had dismissed his foreign minister Litvinov in 1939, among other things, because he was a Jew. Still, thought Hitler, if the racially superior Western European nations had been crushed so easily, then what chance did the Slavs stand? The Russians are inferior, Hitler told Brauchitsch on Halder on December 5th, 1940. The army is leaderless. The German forces would require no more than 4 or 5 months to crush the Soviet Union. Aside from the ideological primacy of living space, there were also pragmatic reasons for attacking the Soviet Union. Throughout 1940 and the first half of 41, the Third Reich depended heavily on supplies from Eastern Europe. The Non-Aggression Pact signed between Ribbentrop and the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov on 24th of August 1939 was still in force at this time, of course. Indeed, on 12th of November 1940, Molotov himself arrived in Berlin at Hitler's invitation to discuss future cooperation. On the 10th of January 1941, the Soviet Union signed a new trade agreement which doubled the quantity of grain exports from the Ukraine to the Third Reich, the Ukraine. Thus, ironically convincing Hitler, if he needed convincing, that the Soviet Union possessed almost limitless supplies of foodstuffs, which would be essential for the further conduct of the war and the general future of the Third Reich. Stalin's concessions to German trade demands thus did little or nothing to affect the timing of the German invasion. Whatever the Soviets might offer, Hitler had no intention of abandoning his plans. On December 18th, he ordered the armed forces to be ready to crush the Soviet Union in a rapid campaign to begin the following spring. His comparative haste was not least a consequence of his failure to defeat Britain. And he also wanted to be in a good position to fight the Americans because he thought they were coming in as well. If Russia is smashed, he told his generals in July 1940, it is the end of any hopes that might move England still to hope for a change in the situation. The gentlemen in England aren't stupid, you know, he told Field Marshal Fedor von Bock in early January 1941. They'll realize there's no purpose for them carrying on the war when Russia has been beaten and eliminated from it. Moreover, he added some weeks later, it was necessary to launch the invasion before Britain was defeated. If it came afterwards, the German people would not support it. The code name for the invasion, supplied by Hitler himself, was Operation Barbarossa, named after Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor and German crusader in the 12th century. Like, Hitler needed to invade Ukraine to keep the buffer state out of NATO. Yeah, true. Okay, so his opinions on the Soviet Union becoming more nuanced because the Jew is gone. You fucking retard. Okay, whatever.
But I'll say, like, in that one, like, I couldn't bring myself to I couldn't put myself in the shoes of the people who were doing those things, and I didn't really try. And it comes across much more polemical than any of my other work. And a lot of people love it because it does, expose a lot of the crimes that happened during that period and stuff. But I think it's hard sometimes. I'll tell you one thing. I'm not a Stalin expert. I don't speak Russian, but I have read about Stalin my whole life. And one thing that I was very surprised to learn
It came out right after the everything collapsed in 91, and the British historian, a Russian speaker, got access to a lot of the Stalin archives, the personal archives. And I was amazed to read in this book, Court of the Red Tsar, amazing book.
Oh, part of his defenses of Putin now and Russia have probably led him, Tucker Carlson, of all people, to start sympathizing with Stalin as well. Okay.
That is a great book.
It is a great book.
Yeah.
But the thing that it overturned, I mean, I'm older than you, so maybe you always knew this, but growing up, we didn't. Everyone thought Stalin was this bloodless technocrat, not a true believer at all. That was Lenin. Certainly Trotsky seemed like a true believer. Zinoviev, Kamenev, all the guys around him might have been, but he was not. And you learn in reading this, so he was actually a devout, like religious level communist, which either makes him more repulsive or less, depending. I could see it from either side, but it's definitely not what we thought he was. And what I loved about that was your view of something. It's a small thing, I guess, for most people. It was a big thing for me to learn that. But your whole kind of accepted view of something can turn out to be utterly false. Like a lot of history is just completely fake. And so when you see someone who's diving in face first with like courage and honesty, you just have to applaud. That's why I just applaud. I can't wait to find out what you conclude. Where are you, by the way, in this process?
Well, I'm currently working on a series. I'm probably going to do 2 more episodes on it, on the history of the American labor movement. It's not a narrative history of the entire labor movement. I pick certain episodes. I talk about the Battle of Blair Mountain in one episode, do one on the Haymarket Affair. And really it's about the industrial wars of like the late 18th century from Pittsburgh to Chicago and everything. I did one on this 1968 teachers union strike in New York City that's kind of famous now, the Ocean Hill, Brownsville. And that was one that a lot of my research for the Jonestown podcast about the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South came in really handy.
It's called the Jonestown podcast. Okay.
Because really what it's about is, it was a conflict in the New York's political system, like that centered around a school in Brooklyn at a time when 75% of the teachers in New York City were Jewish. And New York it's such an interesting city for the fact that it's obviously this multi-ethnic, multicultural city that over the years just is where everybody washed up for the most part on our shores. And from the Irish migrations to the Jewish and Italian migrations and everybody that came after that, there was conflict, and people had to figure out and eventually come to a settlement of like, how are we going to live here together and all feel like we are being represented and so forth. And so you had this city where, again, like today, this sounds almost it sounds like a different world in some ways, where the teachers were pretty much all Jews. The transit workers, pretty much all Irish. The cops were mostly Irish. The firemen were mostly Irish. Most of the construction trade, the dock workers, things like that, they were all Italians. And everybody it wasn't something like that's what they gravitated to.
Sanitation too. Italian.
Sanitation, yeah. But that was their economic territory. And they had certain neighborhoods that were theirs. And people kind of knew that it's not like a Jew couldn't move into an Italian neighborhood or vice versa or something. But everybody knew that this was an Italian neighborhood and it was going to stay that way. And they'd all kind of come to this settlement in a natural way. Like there was an emergent order that came over the years. And when, and again, there was conflict at every stage of that. After the 1924 immigration law that essentially cut off European immigration and generally immigration in general, the cheap source of labor that industry turned to were African Americans from the South. And so you saw over the course of about 40 or 50 years, about 6 or 7 million African Americans move out of the rural South to the northern and western cities. And it turned out when they got up there...
So we're done with the World War II. Okay. That was incredibly boring and stupid and kind of evil. Okay. Well, there's a few more Tucker Carlson fans are... probably been given more than enough threads to start pulling on and yank them into the Nazi sphere. Nice one. Good. Time for a Churchill thread. Apparently this is him. Time for a Churchill thread. Time for a Churchill thread. Oh my God. Why is he so boring? Let's do this. Why I think Churchill was a chief villain of World War II. I know that sounds like hyperbole. Churchill didn't order the most deaths, oversee the most atrocities, or commit the worst crimes. But most of those crimes could not have been committed if the war had not happened, and Churchill was the leader most intent on making it happen. Ooh. You'll think, but Daryl, everyone knows the war started after Germany invaded Poland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, and before that. It could have been prevented if only people had listened to Churchill, taken a tougher line against Hitler, and you might be right. Sort of. Let's rewind the first community note. Let's rewind the clock to World War I. Churchill is the boss of the British Navy, and in 1915, he implements a hunger blockade of Germany and Austro-Hungary. Over the course of the war, up to 750,000 Germans would die of starvation and hunger-related causes. The maritime blockage of food supply was only implemented after the German government declared to seize all grain imports to feed the army. Okay. Also, the Germans tried themselves to create hunger in the UK by unrestricted submarine warfare, even sinking neutral ships. Oh, the Lusitania. And that led to anti-German riots in Liverpool. What's this? Oh, Kalinda's got some documents. Primary sources. Nice one. Hang on. Tangent. The blockade, wrote Churchill, treated the whole of Germany as if it were a beleaguered fortress, starved the whole population. Okay. For 2.5 centuries, Europeans refrained from tactics like mass starvation and other means of targeting civilian populations. What? Okay. That's not true. What? Napoleon? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, these have community notes. It's fine. Whatever. I want to look at documents. This is High Command of the Wehrmacht March 13th, 41, so a couple of months before Barbarossa. Orders for special areas in connection with Directive Number 21. Within the area of army operations, the Reichsführer SS will be entrusted on behalf of the Führer with special tasks for the preparation of the political administration, tasks which derive from the decisive struggle that will have to be carried out between the two opposing political systems. Within the framework of these tasks, the Reichsführer SS will act independently and on his own responsibility. Apart from this, the executive power vested in the Supreme Commander of the Army and in command levels acting under his orders will not be affected. The Reichsführer SS will ensure that operations are not interfered with by the execution of his tasks. Details will be worked out directly between the High Command of the Army and the Reichsführer SS. Okay, that's Himmler. Oh, Himmler giving the authorities to the SS to do their thing. Extract from Guidelines by Heydrich for higher SS and police leaders in the occupied territories, July. Ooh, we're getting July. Okay. Owing to the fact that the chief of the order police invited to Berlin the higher SS and police leaders and commissioned them to take part in Operation Barbarossa without informing me of this in time, I was unfortunately not in a position to also provide them with basic instructions for the sphere of jurisdiction of the security police and SD. Now, these were the guys who were running up the Jews, weren't they? These people. What's this? In the following, I make known briefly the most important instructions given to me by me to the Einsatzgruppen, oh no, and commandos of the security police and the SD with the request to take note of them. Executions. All the following are to be executed. No, I thought they didn't have a plan, bro. I thought they're just going to invade and try to feed everyone. No. Officials of the Comintern, together with professional communist politicians in general, top and medium officials, and radical lower-level officials of the party, central committee and district and sub-district committees, people's commissars, Jews in party and state employment, and other radical elements, saboteurs, propagandists, snipers, assassins, inciters, etc., insofar as they are, in any particular case, required or no longer required to supply information on political or economic matters which are of special importance for the further operations of the security police or for the economic reconstruction of the occupied territories. The struggle against Bolshevism demands ruthless and energetic action, and first of all against Jews as well as the main bearers of Bolshevism. There will, therefore, I thought Hitler had a more nuanced view on Soviets and communism at this point. All right. There will, therefore, be no cooperation whatever between the Wehrmacht and the Jewish population, whose attitude is openly or secretly anti-German, and no use is to be made of individual Jews for any preferential auxiliary services for the Wehrmacht. Under no circumstances are papers to be issued by military officers to Jews confirming that they're employed for purposes of the Wehrmacht. The only exception to be made is the use of Jews in specially organized labor columns, which are only to be employed under German supervision. It is requested to make this order known to the troops. Damn, archives. That's quite valuable. This is from Documents on the Holocaust. I might get this. That's a good book. Nice one. Primary sources, bro. Everyone loves primary sources. These documents were planted by Stalinists, by Zionists, sorry. Where's the clip?
I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland. You know, Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler's chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You know, you have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the High
He really said they had no plan for the prisoners of war, for the political prisoners.
Man in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle? They went in with no plan for that.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. There is a more nuanced interpretation, which is when you can talk about how there wasn't really, like, the final solution, that as a plan did develop over time. Like, the final solution meant something different, like, to different people in 1941, but then by 1942 it meant extermination. That's it to everyone. But before then, some people took it to mean like deport them or like. But that's very different from they had no plan for what to do with political prisoners. What the fuck? Jesus. All right, let's see. Yehuda Bauer. Yeah, Yehuda Bauer's like a functionalist. Like historians disagree on when exactly the final solution meant kill them all. Like when exactly it meant that to everyone. But it's usually understood that they more or less decided that in a couple of months before Wannsee, that it was pretty much widely understood. Okay. What is this? Oh, June 1941. In the fight against Bolshevism, it is not to be expected that the enemy will act in accordance with the principles of humanity or international law. Funny. The political commissars of all kinds who are the real bearers of resistance can be expected to mete out treatment to our prisoners that is full of hate, cruel, and inhuman. The army must be aware of the following. The barbaric Asiatic fighting methods are originated by the political commissars. Action must therefore be taken against them immediately without further consideration and with all severity. When they are picked up in battle or resistance, they are, as a matter of principle, to be finished immediately with a weapon. Nice. Holy heckin' based. Okay. What's the other one say? The area of Barbarossa. Okay. Even if they're only suspected. Oh, Elon Musk is now praising community notes. Hitler tried again going on the radio to broadcast a call for peace directly to the British people. He would give back the parts of Poland that were not majority German and would work with the other powers to reach an acceptable solution to the Jewish problem. He was ignored. The tweet refers to the appeal to reason by Hitler in July 1940. By this time, Hitler had invaded two direct allies of Britain, Poland and France, broken multiple treaties, and Einsatzstaffen were killing Jews, Poles, and others. Grossly misleading. Nice one. Okay, Elon Musk. Okay, we got Elon Musk. Elon Musk on side. I bet his fans are fucking furious. Haha! Let's go! Ryan fucking Dawson. Poor Elon. He normally gets 100,000 likes. Now it's only 30,000. Poor Elon. Breaking treaties at breakneck speed. Clever. Do you think this type of rewriting history has always been around or has it gained popularity? I mean, it's easier for people to get their word out now, but I think it's always been the case, yeah. Yeah, isn't that the thing? Isn't like a lot of like strong man theory, didn't that originate from a bad historian? Or like yeah, in like the 1800s. So yeah, it's always had its head rearing.